video, I want to take some time and look at a couple of formulas that I typically use when running back of the napkin sketches to determine the productivity of an aquaponic or hydroponic system. So these are simple formulas that we're going to use in order to either look at a given system design with a certain number of plant sites and determine how much produce we can yield from that system, or we can use them in the other order, which would be we know that we need to produce a certain amount of crop, and so how many plant sites do we need in a given aquaponic or hydroponic system. It's important to note that this formula, as we're going to look at it in this video, is pretty much used just for looking at crops that are whole site harvest crops. So things like lettuces, whole harvest herbs, some whole harvest kale and collard varieties where you're taking the entire plant from the plant site, harvesting it, and then starting a new plant in that plant site. So not things where you are doing what's called harvest and leave, where you harvest some of the mature leaves off of the crop and then leave the plant there in order to come back and harvest again. So things like basils might be harvested more than one time, things like kale, some collard varieties, tomatoes, most of your fruiting crops. In fact, there's other formulas that we use in order to figure out the productivity per crop over unit time. When looking at those sorts of crops, this formula is really good at getting a broad understanding of how many turnovers of the site we can see in a given amount of time. And so very good formula to use for things like head lettuces, whole harvest herbs, things like that. So the formula we're going to be using, and we'll look at a number of different facets with the formula, is that we will take the total number of plant sites in the facility divided by the days to harvest, and that is the days to harvest that for the crop that you're growing. So that's the number of days that the plant is occupying space in your aquaponic or hydroponic environment. This is the total number of sites that the plant will occupy that are available for the plant to occupy. So it gets interesting when you look at systems with crop rotations where you're using more than one type of plant site. So in any larger facilities or commercial facilities, you will have typically seeding sites and then nursery sites and grow out sites, and you'll move your plants from site to site to site, either through a single transplant cycle or a double transplant rotation. And we'll look at how this formula can be used in order to ensure that you have a proper crop rotation. We'll talk about that once we get past this section. But at its core, it's the total number of plant sites that you have available for plants to be held in your aquaponic and hydroponic system, divided by the days to harvest, which is how many days the plant that you're looking at and assessing for productivity, is occupying those sites. And that will give you the estimated number of sites that can be harvested per day. And that number can be fiddled with in order to make it harvested number per day. They're doing 10 per day, that's 70 per week, 300 per month. And so you can extrapolate that out. Or you can, if you know the average yield in weight of your crop that you're growing. So let's say we're growing something like a red Salanova lettuce or a bib lettuce, and we get an average of 8 ounces per head. Then we can say that we have a certain number of them being harvested per day. We have the average weight. We can very quickly calculate how much weight of that crop we're able to harvest per unit time. So we'll dig into that as well in this video, and we'll talk about some of the nuances to that. But the basic formula we're going to be looking at is this total number of plant sites in the growing system divided by the estimated days to harvest for the crop that we're assessing, and that will give us the total number of sites that we are harvesting per day. And again, this is used for crops where we're harvesting the whole plant site and taking the whole plant out and replacing with a new plant at harvest time. So the first thing that we need to calculate in order to use this formula is the total number of sites in our system. And if you have a small system, an at-home system that's relatively compact, it's a very easy calculation. You could just count the number of plant sites. So for a small system, let's say, as an example, we have a single 4-foot by 8-foot float bed, deep water culture float bed. We're using 2-foot by 4-foot rafts, so that'll give us 4 rafts, and then we can take, and let's assume that we're drilling the rafts out to be grow out raft spacing for lettuce. So we're going to put 18 plants per raft. So we have our 18 plants per raft. That's plant sites per raft. So 18 by 4 would be 72 total plant sites in this system. And so we're going to assume that we don't have any sort of germination trays off to the side, that this system is strictly a single float bed strapped to something like an IBC or a small fish tank, and the total number of plant sites that we have in our system is 72. So we can very easily calculate in small systems the number of plant sites that we have, especially when we only have one type of plant site. But when we get into larger systems, it gets a little bit more complicated because, as mentioned, in larger systems and commercial systems, we typically have 2 or 3 different spacings of plant sites or different types or classifications of plant sites in our aquaponic system. So if we had a large system, so let's look at a large commercial system, and we're going to assume that it has 2 40-foot by 80-foot deep water culture beds. So those will be 3,200 square feet. So those will be 3,200 square foot per bed. There's 2 of them. So that's our bed size. We're going to assume we have 2 foot by 4 foot rafts. So there will be 400 rafts in each bed. And we're going to assume that one of the deep water culture beds is designated for grow out plant sites and one is designated as a nursery. So the nursery will have plant spacing in the sites that are 2 to 3 inches apart, while the grow out will be on that 6 to 8 inch spacing. So we're going to say that this is our number of rafts. We're going to say that our nursery rafts have 36 plants per site, and our grow out sites have 18 plants per site. So this is our number of sites per raft, and so that gets us to 14, 4, and 7, 2. And so we have 14,400 and 7,200 sites inside of this system. Again, the 14.4 is our number of nursery sites, and our 7.2 is the number of grow out sites that we have. So let's just make a note of that. These are nursery, and these are grow out sites. So again, denser plants, tighter together, our grow out sites, then we're spaced apart. And so this way, as our plant is growing, we're transplanting it. We're going to call this a double transplant cycle because we're going to have a seeding table in here. And so basically they start out in the 1x1 rock wool cubes. They get transplanted into nursery sites where they're rather dense. They spend part of their life there, and then they get transplanted again so that they're occupying only the space that the plant needs as it's growing. So we maximize our productivity per square foot. There's a lot of formulas behind that about whether, having a double transplant while it increases the productivity per square foot is worth the labor or worth the contact risk. If you're looking at it from a food safety standpoint, there are some benefits to touching your plants multiple times. If you can keep your food safety concerns down, it allows you to evaluate plants, it allows you to cull plants out, it allows you to inspect for pests, truly inspect for pests because you're handling the plants at least twice during the life of the plant. So there are some benefits, there are some problems with it, but for now we're going to assume a double transplant rotation. So in addition to this, we're going to add a seeding rack. We'll add the big system, so we're going to add 3 of them, and we're going to use vertical seeding racks. So we'll have vertical racks, 3 vertical racks. Each one can hold 12 sheets of rock wool. We're going to assume that they are the 98 cube rock wool. And so 3 of them by 12 by 98, that's another 3,528 sites. So we'll drag that over. We'll go our 3,528 seeding sites, and that's going to give us a grand total of 128 sites. So that means that our facility as a whole has, and these numbers are important for when we actually check our rotation, so we want to make sure we keep track of these numbers. We have 14,400 nursery sites. We have 7,200 grow out sites. we have 3,528 seeding sites, and that gives us our grand total of 25128 is our total number of sites. And so these numbers we want to keep track of as we move forward so that we can not just determine the estimated productivity per number of sites in our system, but to ensure that when we actually get a rotation and we get an estimated production, that we can ensure that the rotation works. And so we're going to plug the total number of plant sites into our overall formula. So let's say we have our 25,128 total sites. We're going to assume that we're working with a crop like, let's say, a bib lettuce that takes 47 days from the time that it is seeded into our system to the time that it gets cut and harvested and packaged. We're going to say it takes 47 days. A nice, easy number to work with. So we have 47 days to harvest, and that's going to give us our estimated number of plant sites that we can harvest per day. So this one I have, that's 535 number of sites harvested per day. And so that's the number of physical plants that we are cutting in sites that we're harvesting per day. And on that harvest day, if we're doing a double rotation, that means that we're harvesting 535 sites per day. We are transplanting roughly 535 nursery plants into grow out sites that day, and we are seeding out what we're transplanting from the seeding table into the nursery sites that same day, and then we are seeding out an additional 535 sites per day. Typically, we add 10% to that in order to ensure that we don't, have bad germination issues ripple through the whole project. So, let's say we're seeding out 600 plants that day. So we're harvesting 350, we're harvesting 535, we're transplanting 535, we're transplanting 535 from nursery to grow out, seeding to nursery, and then we're seeding out an additional 600 plants per day. And so this is our estimated productivity of this sort of a system per day. And so when we extrapolate that out, that gets us to, assuming just a round 30-day month, that gets us to a little over 16,000 per month. 16,000 heads or sites per month. And again, this is sites that we're harvesting. And so this formula is used for, again, plants where we are taking the whole plant, packaging it, getting it out, and making that site available for transplant. So we can extrapolate further. Let's say that we know that the average bib lettuce head that we're harvesting from this facility, we have, this facility's been running, or we have other facilities like it, and so we have an estimation of the size of the yield of the actual heads of lettuce. So let's assume that we're talking about 8-ounce heads of lettuce, and that will give us half of this. So 8,000 and let's say 20 pounds of lettuce per month. And so we can very easily go from number of heads, number of sites or heads harvested per day to the number of sites or heads harvested per week or per month, or we can take information that we have about the plant that we're growing, the estimated yield, and we can get that converted over to not necessarily a number of heads, but to a weight, which is typically how we end up selling produce. So that gets us to these numbers. And so we can say, fantastic, this is awesome, we've just designed a system, and that system's going to produce 16,000 heads per month. But this isn't where we need to stop. We need to actually take this one step further, and we need to then plug this number back into our formula in order to determine how long our plants are going to remain in each of the different types of plant sites. So we can take this number, plug it back into our formula, and we can determine how long do we expect our plants to stay inside the seeding germination trays, how long are they going to stay inside the nursery sites, how long are they going to stay inside the grow out sites. And this is really important to ensure that we have a realistic crop rotation. So the next thing that we're going to do is take that number and plug it into the formula and get some of those, tease out some of those nuances that arise and some of the problems that we typically see arise when people are speccing out systems. And they can get really excited about some giant number of productivity, which might not necessarily be realistic. This one's got a good balance of nursery, grow out, and seeding sites, so it should work, but we're going to plug it in and check. So in the previous part of this lesson, we looked at the base formula that we use for determining the estimated production potential of a given site. And that formula was written out the total number of sites divided by the days to harvest is equal to the estimated number of heads or sites that can be harvested per day. And so, while this is the base formula, these things can mean different things. So when we say the total number of plant sites, in the previous example, we were looking at the total number of sites within an aquaponic system. This can be the total number of any given classification or group of sites that we're evaluating in a system. So if we just want to say what would half of our system produce, we could just take a certain portion of our system and say, okay, you have this many sites in this area, what can it produce? We can also use this part of the formula to say a certain classification of sites. And this is important to the next form of this formula that we're going to look at, which allows us to determine the estimated rotation of our crops through our system. And so this can mean the total number of, if we're evaluating seeding sites, the total number of seeding sites inside of our germination chambers or our germination racks. If we're looking at just the nursery sites in our system, we can say the total number of nursery sites. So this is just the total number of sites that we are evaluating at any point in time to derive some other portion of this formula. So this can vary. This is just the total number of sites that we're looking at. Days to harvest is interesting because when we're looking at the time that a plant spends occupying space inside of our system, we worry about the days to harvest. We're saying how many days is it between the time that I put a seed into my system and the time that I get to yield out a head of a crop, a head of lettuce. But what this can also just be is essentially just the days that the plant is occupying any site. So it's just the days in those sites being evaluated. So we have our total number of some classification of sites, and then the number of days that a plant at any stage in its life is occupying those sites that we're evaluating. So we can say the total number of nursery sites and say, okay, how many days is it going to be in that nursery site? So it might not necessarily be the full life cycle of the plant, but it's the amount of time that the plant is occupying this classification of sites, whatever type of site we're evaluating. And this will be made significantly clearer when we actually go through an example, but it's important for us to know how we're getting the second formula from the first. This third part, heads or sites harvested per day. Again, when we're looking at the total timeline or life cycle of a crop inside of our system, we're worried about the time from seed to harvest, and we're very interested in how many plants am I harvesting and packaging and able to sell per day. When we're looking at a given classification of sites, it's not necessarily harvest, it's transplant, quite honestly. It's how many sites am I going to be able to transplant out of per day, or do I need to transplant out of per day to establish a certain rotation, and how many sites are going to be vacated for me to transplant into. And so this is actually can be looked at as the sites being transplanted per day. And so in order to derive our next formula from this one that we're going to use in the following sections of this lesson, let's just quickly assign these all a variable. X over y equals z. And so we have x over y equals z, and we have that is equal to x equals z y, which is equal to x over z equaling y. And so this is essentially the second formula we're going to use, derived from the first, in order to establish a crop rotation. And plugging our things back in, plugging our actual classifications and the verbiage that we're using around these variables, we will then have our total number of sites that we are evaluating. So this can be any classification of sites, divided by the sites that are being transplanted per day, which we are deriving from our initial formula. So when we've determined how many sites are inside of our system, or how many sites we are evaluating for a rotation, we have that number. And then we have our sites being transplanted, which is essentially our sites being harvested per day. So that's derived from our first formula when we do the first set of math that we just looked at in the previous portion of this lesson. And that will tell us the time in days that the plants are occupying a given classification of site. So this is the time in days that the plants are occupying a given site. So time per site, essentially. So we're going to look at in the next section of this lesson how we apply this formula to determine if we can establish a stable crop rotation in a given scenario with certain parameters and different types of classifications of sites, so different numbers of seeding to nursery to grow out sites. And this is the formula we're going to use for doing that. So we'll end up taking, ultimately, the total number of heads harvested per day number that we're working with. We'll plug that into our formula where we are evaluating the specific given number of seeding sites divided by the estimated sites being harvested or transplanted per day. And that will tell us how long those plants are going to stay in those sites. So we'll do this for the seeding sites, we'll do it for the nursery sites, and we'll do it for the grow out sites independently. And that will give us three numbers. So that'll give us, let's just go make it easy, A, B, and C, and that will establish our rotation, our time rotation. And so when we divide our number of seeding sites divided by our estimated transplant number per day or our harvest number per day, we're going to get a number. When we do that by our nursery, we'll get another number. When we get our grow out, we'll get another number. And we want to make sure that those numbers make sense. And we're going to talk about that in the next section of this lesson. We're going to look at a couple of different examples of how we can use this formula to confirm that the number that we're getting, given the total number of sites inside of our system, makes sense. That the productivity of our system isn't just calculated and we just say, okay, great, we can produce X number of heads of crops, but to actually evaluate whether the amount of crops that we're expecting our system to produce can be produced given a stable crop rotation, given the types of sites that we have and the number of those sites that we have, the number of seeding sites, the number of nursery sites, and the number of grow out sites in order to maintain a stable crop rotation in our system. Okay, so continuing on with the example that we just looked at, our plant sites went 3,528 seeding sites, and then we had 14,400 nursery sites, and we had 7,200 grow out sites. And so what we need to do, as mentioned before, we need to plug in the estimated production potential of the system back into each one of these types of plant sites in order to ensure that we have a stable crop production. So in the previous example, we had an estimated crop production of 535 heads harvested per day. So this was our heads or sites harvested per day. And so again, looking at the total number of plant sites that we're looking at, so total number of a single class of plant sites this time. So let's start with our seeding sites. So our total number of seeding sites is 3,528 seeding sites. And so that will give us an estimated 7 days that the heads of lettuce will spend during their 47-day life cycle inside of a seeding site and occupying seeding site real estate inside of our system, inside of our facility. So we're going to do this with our nursery sites and grow out sites as well. So if we go 14,4 divided by the 535, we will get 27 days. And if we go 7,200 divided by the 535 heads harvested or sites harvested per day, we'll get 13 days. And then just to run a quick check to make sure that we've done this correctly, and this is important because we're going to go through an example just after this about when it's done incorrectly. If we run the check, we go 7, 27, and 13, and that gets us back to 47 days, which was the total age of the crops that we were working with. So we assumed in the previous formula that we would be running the crops in the system for 47 days. Now plugging it backwards and putting our estimated harvest per day back into each of the different types of plant sites, we can see that the plants are going to spend 7 days inside of a 1x1 seedling cube, which from the time that it's seeded to when it gets transplanted, depending on lighting and most importantly temperature, water temperature and air temperature, that's an okay amount of time. It could go a little longer, 9-10 days, but we're within the realm of reason. So 7 days inside of a seeding site, and then it will get transplanted. It will spend a significant portion of its time going from a little germinated seedling to a transplantable juvenile plant. So it's going to spend 27 days inside of a nursery site where it's a little bit denser than a grow out site, but has a lot more space than being inside the seeding tray. And then it will spend the last 13 days of the plant's life inside of a grow out, a site where it can kind of head out, flush out, and get a little bit larger. And this looks okay. A 7, 27, 13 day cycle isn't terrible, but let's see if we can shift the entire equation towards the grow outs a little bit more. So let's see if we can get these things to spend more time, these plants to develop for more time inside of the grow out stage than they are inside the nursery stage. And so to do this, we're just going to simply increase the number of grow out sites inside of our facility relative to the number of nursery sites. And so we're going to go back, look at those 400, 400, 800 rafts that we have available to us, and we're going to allocate, and let's, in the next example, make 600 of those rafts grow out, and so they'll have 18 sites per raft, and we will make the other 200 nursery, and they will have the 36 plants sites per raft. And so we will wipe this clear, and we will look at a scenario where we take the exact same equipment, the same 2 large float beds and the 3 vertical germination towers, but we slide the ratio of nursery and grow out more in favor of grow out sites. We'll give more grow out sites to this equation, and we will see what it turns out into. So let me wipe this clear, and then we will plug the new numbers in. Okay, so as mentioned, we are going to try to shift the growth cycle and the rotation in favor of the grow out sites. We're going to take some of the, what were nursery rafts and convert them over to grow out rafts. So in this system, we're going to look at having the same equipment as far as the footprint and having 2 large 40 foot by 80 foot deep water culture beds and the 3-tier vertical germination tower. So our germination tower is going to stay the same. We're not messing with that. So we're still going to have 3,528 seeding sites. Then we're going to take and we're going to convert 600 of our 800 rafts to grow out sites. So that'll get us 6 and 800 is 10,800. And then we're going to take the other 200 sites, or 200 rafts, we're going to plug those as nursery rafts, so they'll have 36 sites per raft, and that will give us 7,200 nursery sites. So now we have significantly more grow out sites than we do nursery sites, and we're going to see how this affects the crop rotation in the double transplant cycle and how long crops will be staying inside of the different types of sites inside of our system. So just as a refresher, before we had, they spent 7 days in the nursery sites, and then they spent 27 days in, they spent 7 days in the seeding sites, 27 days in the nursery sites, and then they spent 13 days in the grow out sites. And so we had a 7, 27, and 13 day cycle. And again, that gave us our 47 days. So we do that check to make sure that we haven't lost a number somewhere along the way. That gives us 47 days that this plant is occupying the space, which is what we originally projected for the crop. And that comes from either experience growing a crop, or from back of the seed packet, or some growing data that you've acquired. So you can get an estimation of days to harvest and weight at harvest and things like that from other sources. But we're assuming 47 days, and it worked out to 47 days. So now we're going to take this, and we're going to get us a new total number of sites. And our new total number of sites is going to work out to being, it's going to go down, and it's going to go down to 528. That's actually not bad. 528. Total number of plant sites. So it decreased because we took rafts that originally had 36 sites per raft, and now we've converted a bunch of them over to only having 18 sites per raft. So our total number of plant sites has gone down. If we divide that by our 47 days to harvest, we are going to get that we can now only produce 458 sites harvested or heads harvested per day. And so we've gone down from 535 heads harvested per day or sites harvested per day to 458 sites harvested per day. And so when we plug that back in, again, we're going to put it over our 3,528 divided by our 458, which is our estimated production per day, sites per day. We're going to get 7 because we haven't messed with our seeding trays at all. When we do the 10,800, so again, the total number of total number of sites that we're evaluating. So our grow out sites are our 10,800 divided by the 458. This is our seeding sites, just to not lose track of this, because this is a little bit, the nursery sites and grow sites are in kind of the wrong order, but our 1080 divided by the 458 is going to be 24 days that they'll spend inside of grow out sites. And when we look at our nursery sites, our 7,200 divided by that same 458, we end up with 16 days inside of nursery sites. And so when we add all of these up, we get our 20, 40, 47. So we double check our numbers. We are at 47 days, but now we have 47 days with a 7/16/24, because these, I swapped where we put them last time. So this is going to end up being a 7/16/24 rotation. So our plant, we will seed it. It will spend 7 days inside of a germination tray inside of its rock wool sheet. Once it's germinated at 7 days and it's got its little true leaf sticking out above the rock wool, it will get pinched and transplanted into a nursery site where it will spend 16 days, and then it will be pulled from the nursery site and put into a grow out site for the next 24 days, and that will give us our 47 days to harvest. So that checks out. So the last thing I want to look at here is, what happens when people use the formulas wrong, and what are some common mistakes that people make using the formulas, and then what are some common mistakes that people make when designing systems. And so this is where I've seen systems go sideways so fast, and where people get really caught off guard because they run a bunch of numbers on paper and they build a system and they can't understand why they can just never seem to get the production established, and they can't get the proper crop rotation down. And it typically comes down to one of two problems. The first problem, which these numbers actually demonstrate for us, is we had to, when we made a change to our system, when we actually took and went from having half of our rafts designated, 400 rafts designated for 400 rafts designated for nursery, and we swapped it out so that there was 600 designated for grow out and only 200 designated for nursery. We changed the actual configurations of the system. And so what we had to do is we had to retally the total number of plant sites and divide it by the 47 days. We have to go way back to the beginning, scratch all of the original numbers that we were playing with, and say, okay, what's the new total number of plant sites divided by the established days to harvest, and we had to get a new number, which was our 458. And I see people all the time not go back. They go, okay, so if I just change the number of plant sites, I've got my 10,000, let's say I got my 3,528 seeding sites. Now I have 10,800 grow out sites. I have my 7,200 nursery sites. And yeah, before we were harvesting our 535 heads per day on our sites per day. And so they'll just, that number stuck. That they think that growing equipment produces that number, but it's that the configuration number of sites of that growing equipment produces that number. And so it's very common to see people go, okay, let's use that number, let's divide it out across the board. And if we did this, we would actually end up with, this would stay the same because nothing's changed. Divided by our 535 gets us somewhere around 13, and that's a clean one, that's 20. And so they'll divide it all out, and they'll go, okay, I'm on a 7, 13, 20 rotation. And this is why we do the check to make sure that our total number of days estimated for the crop matches up with our days given to us by the rotation numbers. And this is why we run rotation numbers, to make sure that the rotation makes sense and to make sure that the rotation makes sense for the actual system that we're working with, especially if we make any changes to the configuration. Because when we tally this up, we only get to 40. And it was a 47-day crop, which means no matter how hard we try and will for our system to produce crops properly and get on a rotation, if we don't go back to the beginning formula and replug it in to get our new days to harvest for the new configuration of plant sites that we've established, we're going to end up having a rotation that doesn't actually work. We're going to try and get this 7, 13, 20-day rotation, and we're going to be trying to produce 458 heads per, or 535 heads given this new site number, total number of sites, and it's going to get completely thrown out of whack. And so that's why we do this check each time, and why every time that you make a change, if you say, okay, let's shift it to 700 grow out rafts and 100 nursery, you've got to retally your plant sites, calculate it out by the number of rafts times the number of sites per raft. You have to get your new numbers, and then you have to add them back up, and you need to redivide them out by your days to harvest for the crop that you're working with to get a new estimated productivity per day. And that's what you're going to use in order to divide back into your different numbers of different types of plant sites to make sure that you have a stable rotation that's actually achievable in the real world. So that's common error number one, would be not going back to the base formula every time that you make a change or alteration to the number of plant sites or the ratio of different types of plant sites. And then number two, that's very common, is people don't tally up their estimated days on the rotation and realize that there might be an error along the way. So this is a good check. It's 40 days. We know that we did something wrong. That will trigger us to think, oh yeah, I didn't flip this number for the new number. I didn't recalculate my days to harvest. I didn't calculate my heads harvested per day, and I need to do that in order to ensure that I get a proper number. The second big problem that arises, so this is a formula issue. The next big problem that arises is people swinging numbers early on inside of their proposals or inside of their designs. I see this a lot in proposals for hydroponic and aquaponic systems out there, where the first formula, looking at total number of plant sites divided by days to harvest, the best way to drastically increase the productivity of a given square foot of a system or a given design is to just give it more sites. And so very frequently we will see, I've seen over the years, people jacking up the number of seeding sites because you can drastically increase seeding. Every rockwool sheet that you get added into the system, you get 98 more sites. Or you'll see people just drilling every single raft out as a nursery raft, and then they're all excited because they've got just twice as many plant sets as they did when they started the day. They had a problem meeting a production number for a proposal, and so instead of having 18 sites per raft, they'll drill out 36 or 24, and they'll just start shoving sites in, because as you slowly increase the number of total sites in the system, the days to harvest stays the same, but your productivity per day just goes up really quickly. And so that's a problem, and I just want to look quickly as we wrap up at one example of how that becomes a problem and the way that that impacts our numbers, and why you can't just punch holes in a system in order to increase the productivity. Because while yes, the first formula will work, the second formula, the crop rotation formula, plugging it back into itself, that exercise points out a major flaw in jacking up the denser portions of your aquaponic system or hydroponic system. And it's worth looking at because I see it a lot. It's a very common problem that I come along when assessing systems or assessing system designs or proposals for people, is looking at the ratios of nursery sites to seeding sites to nursery sites to grow out sites, and it's more times than not skewed in the wrong direction and skewed towards a lot of plant sites that don't necessarily get you where you need to go. So we're just going to quickly look at that, and then we'll wrap up this video. So in this example, we're going to drastically shift the ratio of plant sites in favor of nursery sites. So we're going to take the previous growing equipment that we looked at before, which is the two 40 by 80 foot deep water culture float beds and the 3 vertical racks that hold 12 sheets of rock wool each and have 98 sites per rock wool cube. We're going to take that same growing equipment, but what we're going to do is we're going to drill out 720 of the rafts, of the 800 rafts, as nursery site rafts with 36 holes per raft, and we're only going to drill out 80 of the available rafts as grow out sites with 18 holes per raft. So we're going to take, again, 720 of the available rafts. We're going to drill them out at 36 sites per raft, and that will get us to 25,920 sites. So we have 25,920 nursery sites. We will take the remaining 80 rafts and we will drill them out to be grow out sites. So grow out rafts, so they'll have 18 holes per raft, and that will give us 1,440 grow out sites. And then we're going to maintain the same number of seeding sites. So we're not going to do anything to the actual germination racks. So that'll maintain that same 3,580, 3,528. All right, let me change that. 3,528 sites for seeding sites. And so we haven't added any more growing equipment to this system. All we've done is added more plant sites to the rafts that we already had available to us. And this allows us to move from around 25,000 sites, which we saw in the previous example, 25,128 sites in the previous example, to a sum of 30,888 total plant sites inside of this equipment. So we've added more than 5,000 plant sites without adding any additional equipment. And this can seem attractive because if we take the total number of plant sites, this is our total number of plant sites, and we divide that by the same 47 days to harvest, so we're working with the same crop, the same bid lettuce type crop that we were working with previously, this will allow us to yield an estimated 657 heads of lettuce per day. And so this is up from the 535 that we previously saw. So we've drastically increased the productivity per day. An extra 120 heads of lettuce a day is, that can be up to an extra $120, $150 worth of income per day and revenue per day. And so this can make numbers very attractive. And it seems like a very simple way to just bolster numbers in a proposal or bolster numbers in a system design. But it does lead to a problem, and we can check that problem by doing what we previously discussed. We can take this formula, augment it a little bit, and plug that new estimated productivity number back into the individual sites to determine how long the plants will have to remain in each type of grow site before it gets transplanted in order to pull off this production figure. So if we take the 35, the seeding sites, so 3,528, and we divide that by the 657, this is our total number of seeding sites divided by the estimated harvest per day. So total number of sites that we're looking at divided by the number of heads that will be occupied and transplanted out of that every day, which is kind of like a harvest number, it's a transplant number out of that site. That will yield us 5 days. And so we know that our plants are going to spend 5 days inside of their seeding sites. And then we can take the nursery sites, which we have a whole bunch of them. So we have 25,920 nursery sites. And we divide that by the 657. And that yields 40. So our plants are going to spend 40 days inside of their nursery sites. Then what we're going to do is divide this into the 1,440, the 657, and that will yield 2. So we will end up having the plants inside of the grow out sites for 2 days. And so this gives us a 542 crop rotation, which means in practicality, when we actually build this facility and try to operate it, in order to hit this level of productivity, we're going to take a rock wool sheet, we're going to seed it out, and then in 5 days, before the plants have even broken the top of the rock-wool cubes, we're going to quickly transplant them into nursery sites, and they're going to stay in their nursery sites for 40 days. 40 out of their 47 days of their growth cycle, they're going to be stuck inside of a nursery site, a nursery raft, which is 2 to 3 inches on center for the plants, so it's not a lot of space. And then after that, we're going to transplant them so they can spend their last 2 days inside of a grow-out site. And this is completely unfeasible. It's a lot of labor, especially this transplant is a lot of labor to move a plant into a site for 2 days before you end up going through and harvesting it. The biggest problem is, one, your plants, two of your biggest problems. Firstly, your plants aren't going to be large enough to safely transplant at 5 days old. So you've got a lot of risk there. But really, having your crops, 47-day-old lettuce crops, trying to survive for 40 days when they're 2 or 3 inches on center inside a nursery site just isn't going to work. You're going to end up with really dense production. Your crops aren't going to grow well. They're going to have issues with improper lighting. They're going to be pressed up against each other. There's not going to be enough physical space for the plants to actually grow well. You're asking for pest problems. This is a guaranteed pest nightmare, having that much crops for that long of a period of time, that tight together. All around, those crops aren't going to do well. So even though, yes, if you run the first formula, you can say, wow, we can produce 657 heads of lettuce per day. This is a great facility. This thing's going to produce some lettuce. We can sell it. We can make some serious money on this system. When it comes to actually implement the system, if we don't go through and do this exercise of replugging the estimated production potential back into the individual sites, we wouldn't necessarily know that we're going to have a bad rotation cycle. So that's why it's really important for us to go through that step of taking the numbers, plugging them back into the original formula, and just determining and looking at understanding how the rotation in the real world will look, and whether it's a feasible rotation or not, whether it's even within the realm of reason to do inside of a real growing environment. Again, just for the sake of having done it, our 45 and our 2, we are at that 47 days. So we do know that the math was carried through correctly. We do have the proper number of days working out in the end, but it's a problematic crop rotation. So that's a brief summary of a formula that's really fundamental to estimating crop production potential for a lot of crops, a lot of those whole harvest crops. This can be used for a number of types of lettuces, some of your whole harvest herbs. If you're doing whole harvest basil, you can use a similar formula to this. And then this also allows us to make sure that we have the proper ratios of seeding sites to nursery sites to grow out sites. So all around, good formulas to have in the back of your head to allow you to do napkin sketches to figure out if you are given a certain volume that you need to produce, what size system do you need, or if you have a given design that you're building, or you have a system that you're operating and you're curious, if I were to grow a certain crop, how can I estimate how much I would be able to grow, or what type of rotation I would need in order to grow it. These formulas are very fundamental, very simple formulas, but they're worth noting and they're worth keeping in the back of your head.